everyone talks about the exodus out of Sydney and Melbourne. The traffic, the mortgage stress, the sense that the good life keeps getting priced further out of reach. But most of that conversation is looking in the wrong direction. It's obsessed with what people are leaving, not where they're actually going. There's a specific stretch of coast in the far southeast of the continent, the Sapphire Coast in New South Wales, bleeding into East Gippsland and Victoria, where the country's retirement map is quietly being redrawn, and almost nobody outside the region has noticed how deliberately it's happening. For decades, the classic Australian retirement fantasy came with a built-in contradiction. You wanted nature, space, quiet, a slower pulse to your days. But you also need the stuff that keeps you alive and connected, a hospital that can actually treat you, internet that works, a GP who isn't booked out for 6 weeks. Chase the first, and you often have to sacrifice the second. Head somewhere with those pillars intact, and you paid Sydney or Melbourne prices for the privilege. That tension has shaped where Australians retire for generations, and it's why so many people default to the same handful of well-worn options. Queensland's gold and sunshine coasts, the Central Coast north of Sydney, or the inland tree-change towns within striking distance of a capital F-bed. What's changed is that one particular corridor of coastline has started solving both sides of that equation at once, quietly and without much fanfare. And today we're breaking down the 5 specific reasons why it's pulling ahead of the more obvious choices. The Southern Ocean does something the rest of this continent simply can't replicate. Most of Australia lives with genuine climate extremes. Scorching interior summers that regularly push past 40 degrees, or the sticky cyclone-prone humidity that defines the tropical north and turns every wet season into an endurance test. The far southeast coast is buffered by cool, consistent ocean currents sweeping up from the Southern Ocean, which moderates both ends of the thermometer in a way meteorologists sometimes describe as a genuine Goldilocks microclimate. Summers rarely spike into the punishing heatwave territory that regularly hits inland New South Wales or central Queensland, and winters stay mild by comparison to Victoria's inland regions, where frost and fog can settle in for weeks. It's not tropical warmth, it's stability, and stability turns out to matter more for long-term comfort than raw temperature ever does. Humidity, in particular, sits meaningfully lower than the northern coastal strip favored by generations of Queensland retirees, and that difference alone changes how livable a place feels day to day, especially for anyone managing joint pain, respiratory conditions, or simply the general discomfort that creeps in with age. There's a reason so many long-time Sapphire Coast and East Gippsland locals describe the climate less in terms of postcard sunshine and more in terms of what it doesn't do to them. No oppressive humidity clinging to the evenings, no weeks-long heat domes trapping the elderly indoors, no bone-deep winter cold that makes every morning a negotiation. Climate isn't just a comfort question either. It quietly determines what you'll spend on cooling, heating, and home maintenance for the rest of your life. What your energy bills look like across every season rather than just the brutal ones, and how much of your year is actually spent outside, doing the things that drew you to a coastal life in the first place. That financial undertone is exactly where the next pillar of this whole equation picks up, which raises the obvious follow-up question, is any of that actually cheaper here, or does it just look that way from a distance? The answer is layered, and it deserves an honest answer rather than a sales pitch. Vega, the commercial heart of the Sapphire Coast, had a median house price sitting around $300,000 back in 2016. By 2021, driven partly by the pandemic-era exodus from the cities, that median had climbed past the $500,000 mark, and broader Vega Valley figures have continued to test toward the $700,000 and $800,000 range in the years since, depending on which coastal pocket you're looking at. That's real growth. And it's worth being upfront about it rather than pretending prices are frozen in some undiscovered bargain zone that somehow escaped everyone else's notice. Local agents describe listings setting new street records within days of going live, and vacancy rates along the coast staying persistently tight, which tells you this isn't some quiet secret anymore. It's an active, competitive market responding to real demand, and the days of picking up a beachside cottage for pocket change are largely behind this particular stretch of coast. But run the comparison against Sydney, where median house prices sit well north of $1 million, or Melbourne, where the gap is nearly as wide, and the equity gap becomes the actual story that matters. A retiree selling a modest Sydney or Melbourne property and relocating to Merimbula, Eden, or inland toward Bega isn't just buying a cheaper house, they're very often walking away with several $100,000 in freed-up equity, money that can fund healthcare, travel, aged care contingencies, or simply remove the low-grade financial anxiety that shadows so much of retirement planning for people who stay locked into capital city property. That's the equity gap realization locals and agents talk about constantly. The sticker price of a coastal home here isn't the number that matters. What matters is the difference between that number and whatever you're walking away from, and for anyone selling out of Sydney or Melbourne, that difference is usually the single largest financial event of their retirement, dwarfing years of careful superannuation planning in one transaction. It's also worth noting that this dynamic isn't uniform across the whole Shire. Inland and more remote pockets have grown far more slowly than the coastal strip itself, which means there's still meaningful variation in value depending on exactly how close to the water and how close to Bega's services you're willing to settle. The Southeast Regional Hospital in Bega, a genuinely major facility built at a cost of roughly $187 million and opened in 2016, now anchors specialist care for the entire far south coast, emergency services, maternity, pediatrics, fracture care, mental health support staffed by specialists and rotating junior doctors rather than the skeleton crews people still associate with country hospitals. Around it sits a genuine network of general practice clinics for the niche specialties that still require a bigger center. Telehealth has closed a meaningful chunk of the gap that used to force people onto a 3-hour drive to Canberra, and the growth of the national broadband network and low Earth orbit satellite options across regional Australia has made that kind of remote consultation not just possible, but genuinely reliable for the first time. It's worth being honest about the limits here too. Some specialties still mean a trip to Canberra or Sydney, and that's a real trade-off, not something to wave away. But the picture of the far south coast as a healthcare dead zone is roughly a decade out of date, and is exactly the kind of outdated assumption that keeps people from seriously considering a move that might otherwise make enormous sense for them. Beyond the spreadsheet math of housing and hospitals, there's a psychological shift happening here that's just as important, and it's one researchers who study retirement transitions come back to constantly. The risk isn't loneliness from moving somewhere remote, it's boredom and identity loss from moving somewhere with no structure to replace the one you left behind. Retirement strips away the built-in social scaffolding of a workplace, and if you don't rebuild something in its place, satisfaction tends to collapse within the first year or two, regardless of how nice the view is. What towns like Bega, Merimbula, and Bairnsdale get right is what sociologists sometimes call the third place, somewhere that isn't home and isn't work, but casual, repeated social contact happens almost by accident. Coastal cafes, bowls clubs, community gardens, local libraries running regular programs, volunteer fire brigades, and coastal care groups that specifically recruit newcomers. The towns along this stretch of coast have decades of practice absorbing retirees and folding them into existing community structures, because they've been doing exactly that since well before the current wave. The early migration into the region has meant that dual housing markets, essentially retirees and young families sharing that same coastal footprint, keeps schools open, keeps main streets from hollowing out, and keeps the kind of intergenerational texture alive that purely retirement-only developments often lack entirely. Now, before we get to where this is all heading, it's worth pausing on a myth that stops a lot of people from even researching this seriously in the first place. There's a lingering assumption that regional coastal towns like these are essentially dead zones, patchy internet, thin services, nothing happening outside of daylight hours. The data doesn't support that anymore. Fixed wireless and fiber NBN rollouts have reached the overwhelming majority of these coastal towns over the past several years, and where the terrain makes that difficult, satellite broadband has filled in the remaining gaps to a level that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Specialist clinic numbers, aged care investment, and hospital capacity have all expanded rather than contracted here, which runs directly against the dying country town stereotypes so much of the public still carries. The reality on the ground looks a lot less like decline and a lot more like a region actively building out the infrastructure to support the population it's already attracting. That infrastructure boom, though, sits right next to a genuine and unresolved tension, because population growth in a place people move to specifically for its unspoiled character eventually collides with the thing that made it desirable in the first place. Local planning bodies across the Sapphire Coast and East Gippsland are actively wrestling with exactly this: how to expand housing supply and services in Bairnsdale, Paynesville and Lakes Entrance without eroding the natural amenity, the beaches, the national parks, the sense of space that's driving the demand to begin with. Growth forecasts for the region point toward continued expansion concentrated in the main service towns, while the more remote rural pockets are expected to stay flat or keep gently declining, which suggests local authorities already understand that growth has to be deliberately channeled rather than left to sprawl unchecked. Whether these towns can hold that balance over the next 20 years, growing their services without diluting their identity, is genuinely still an open question, and it's one worth watching closely if you're thinking about putting down roots here for the next chapter of your life. Because that's really what this entire migration represents. It isn't a retreat from modern life, and it's not people giving up and settling for less. It's an increasingly common, increasingly deliberate calculation, one where the climate is stable rather than extreme, where the equity gap between what you sell and what you buy actually works in your favor, where the hospital and the internet connection are both quietly ready when you need them, and where the social fabric of a small coastal town gives you something a capital city apartment tower never could. Climate, finance, infrastructure. Those are the three pillars holding this whole shift up, and none of them existed in this combination 20 years ago. So the real decision was never simply about which town has the nicest beach or the cheapest listing on the market. It's about how deliberately you want to design the years ahead of you, and whether you're willing to look past outdated assumptions about what regional Australia can actually offer. If there's someone in your life quietly turning that exact question over right now, a parent, a partner, a friend planning their own next chapter, send this their way. It might be the nudge that turns a vague someday into an actual plan.